After hearing about the Africa plantation, it took me several years to find out where it actually was on the River Road. Part of the problem in finding the Africa plantation was my concept of a plantation back then was this big grand house with columns.
There's a common misconception about the word plantation. Most people, when you say plantation, they envision a large white pillared structure, usually in the Greek Revival style, very similar to Homer's house, where in reality less than 1% of the houses of that period, particularly around the mid-19th century, were of that type. Most of them were small, what we would call a petite habitation, very similar to the Africa house or Babin house. It's in the Creole style, which is typical of the early plantation houses along River Road. In the early 18th century, French engineer architect Bernard de Verges actually designed I guess we could call it the first Creole style house, and that they took a typical French type colonial structure and they added a gallery to it, and it's the gallery which makes the house very livable. If you look at it in drawings such as this, then you can see what we're talking about. If you notice the roof line, a very highly pitched roof, and the covered porch, you'll find these same basic characteristics here in Africa House. One of the most important characteristics that had to be incorporated by de Verges in the new house that would fit the Creole environment was to raise it off of the ground, and this would help for many things. One was rising floodwaters in the frequent rains, and also it helped to air the house out, which protected the foundation and would make the house last much longer. The basic framing and construction techniques that you find in Africa, as in most Creole houses, it's a heavy timber type of construction, and then mortises, like here, this, or you might call it a tongue, that was cut out of this piece of wood so that it would fit into this piece of wood, and then a tenon, like a pin right here, was inserted into that space, which makes for a completely wooden construction, which is the superior way of building them with nails because all the materials are the same. These were actually formed out in the field. The connections were made. They were numbered with Roman numerals. They were set upon you might say a guide beam that would go across, and so that you could say you were building a house of 30, then that meant you had 30 subdivisions in one of the main construction walls going across the front of the house. And it was just a way of making the construction out in the field, then bringing it up and literally assembling all the super construction of this house probably within the course of a day. So it's an early example of prefabrication. Babin Africa House was probably built by master craftsmen. I doubt if there was an architect or an engineer involved. It was carrying on the tradition of master building. The people who built this most likely would have been slaves or free people of color.
I was born a slave. My parents was a light gray shade of brownish yellow and were termed mulattoes. My father was a carpenter and considered so intelligent and skillful in his trade that when buildings out of the common line were to be erected, he was sent from long distance to be head workman. Harriet Ann Jacobs.
Many of the finest contractors in New Orleans actually descend from those same families that have been building houses in this part of the world for the last almost 300 years. The word Creole comes from the Spanish word criollo, which comes from the Portuguese word creare, which means to create in a new place. And so basically you're talking about an architecture that is the combination of the indigenous people's architecture, the French and the Spanish, and all those other cultures that made up Creole Louisiana.